Donald Trump is big mad, and he expressed that at this press conference he had this afternoon, hastily convened press conference in response to that decision this morning from the U.S. Supreme Court that basically set aside the tariffs that he imposed using something called the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act. IEPA is the short form for it. That is the justification he gave when he imposed those tariffs initially on Canada at 25% shortly after his inauguration last January, and also later raised to 35%, although we get a big exemption from those tariffs because of the CUSMA agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, the free trade agreement dating back to 2018, that version of it, but originally going back into the 1990s. But the tariffs that remain in place on Canada, on our steel section, on aluminum, on automobile manufacturing and forestry, those were imposed under a different act, something called Section 232 of a different piece of legislation, and those were not addressed by the Supreme Court today. But Trump, in response to having these tariffs knocked down, and keep in mind, these are just not the tariffs he imposed on Canada and Mexico. These are tariffs that he imposed on so-called Liberation Day on April 1st, where he came out and imposed tariffs on pretty much every country in the world, including some countries that aren't even occupied by anything except for penguins. However, the court said he didn't have the justification for it. He overstepped. He should have, to impose those tariffs, he should have consulted Congress. Now, Trump is trying to cast this as a win. At the same time, he's lashing out, as you say, Faiza, at members of the Supreme Court, especially those conservative justices that he himself appointed, including Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, two who were appointed in Trump's first term to the highest court. And he is calling their decision a disgrace and saying the justices that voted against his tariffs should be embarrassed and their families should be embarrassed. But Trump says he has options. There's other ways he can impose these tariffs. And he says today that's exactly what he's going to do. Take a listen to the president.
Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
Now, Canadian officials are welcoming the decision by the Supreme Court. Dominic LeBlanc, the minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, of course, who's been very active on the trade file with the U.S., both acknowledging that it kind of confirms their views of tariffs, but also allowing that the key tariffs, those sectoral tariffs, on steel, aluminum, automobiles, those things remain in place. What we don't know yet, Faiza, and we're waiting to get some more clarity of this from the White House, because it was only just in the last few minutes that Trump unveiled these new tariffs under using a different rationalization, a Section 122, I believe is the code under U.S. law, that he's going to impose this 10% global tariff. Presumably that's a 10% tariff on everyone. We don't know if that's in addition to tariffs imposed on Canada, those sectoral tariffs under Section 232, or this is a brand new tariff. And we also don't know, this is the real crucial point, we hope to find out a little later this afternoon, get some clarity on this, whether or not Canada will continue to enjoy this exemption from tariffs for goods that are traded under the CUSMA agreement, and that is pretty much about 80% of the stuff that we send to the United States now still continues to enter tariff-free. This is a real key point. A setback for Donald Trump. To be clear, this was a signature part of his economic policy. He is convinced that this will ultimately turn around the U.S. economy and bring manufacturing back to the United States that has been outsourced to so many different places in the developing world and places like China and India. All this kind of up in the air right now, but in general, a good sign for Canada, at least, that the courts, in addition to some members of Congress, are now pushing back against tariffs that have been really destructive to the Canadian economy.